Hello, seventh graders. Today is day 2, looking at the middle of the 1850s and Native American battles in Washington. So we're going to continue on with our unit. Today is day 2 out of 4 of Native American battles in Washington. So again, your assignment is similar to your last assignment. You have a choice. You can either watch this video and fill out the Google form, or you can come to the Google Meet where we will do it together. And the same thing as last time, I'm going to talk the first part of this video, and the second part of the video is about an 8-minute video from somebody else that goes into more detail than what I explained. All right, if you don't remember, we were dealing with 5 Native American uprisings that happened in the 1850s in reaction to Governor Isaac Stevens' efforts to move Native Americans to reservations and sign treaties. And last time we looked at the Yakima War, the Puget Sound War, and the Walla battles. We're going to complete that story. So this is the second part of those 3 battles. Just to recap, the Yakima War. The Yakima War was located mostly here on the Yakima Reservation in the middle of our state. And Governor Isaac Stevens has just gotten back from Washington, D.C., where he was actually getting congressional approval for the $200,000 promised to the Yakima tribe. On the other side, you got Chief Kamiunkin, who is in charge of the Yakima as well as the 13 other tribes that make up the newly formed Yakima Nation. He is proving to be a capable and strong leader, and the Yakima have dominated the early battles in this war. You also have General John E. Wool. He is the general sent to the Puget Sound from California in order to put down the Yakima War and the Yakima tribe. However, he is sympathetic to the Native Americans. He doesn't want to do direct attacks. So he has a strategy of occupying Native American hunting land, cutting them off from supplies, shooting the game and the animals that they would live off of. And Governor Isaac Stevens and the other governor in Georgia, the other governor in Oregon, George Law Curry, are currently mad at Wool for being too sympathetic to Native Americans. Meanwhile, you got the Puget Sound War. That's located here in Federal Way, Auburn, Washington, just south of Seattle. And this uprising is led by Nisqually tribal chief Leschi, and he is the leader of the Nisqually tribe. He is another strong military leader, and he's uniting several tribes against the U.S. government, the territorial government in Washington. And his goal is to attack established cities like Olympia and Seattle. And then you have the Walla battles, and that's located here on the Washington-Oregon border. And these were started because the Oregon Territorial Governor, George Law Curry, randomly attacked the Walla, Umatilla, and Cayuse tribes in the area just to make a point that he wouldn't stand for hostile Native Americans, even though these tribes had nothing to do with the Yakima battles or the Puget Sound battles. And then you have a series of fighting that breaks out near Walla. That results in the longest battle in Washington state history, is the Battle of Walla. And Chief Yellowbird, who had turned himself in to be a hostage, ends up killed after the Battle of Walla. All right, and then where we left off last time is the Native Americans are winning every major battle. Governor Stevens is gone for much of it in Washington, D.C. The General John E. Wool, in charge of the United States, believes natives are being treated badly, so he's hesitant to launch direct assaults, and both the territorial governors, Stevens and Curry, want all hostile natives killed or captured. Okay, so that jumps to January of 1856. And under Chief Leschi, many major tribes unite into one effort. This includes the Klickitat, Spokane, Palouse, Walla, Yakima, Nisqually, and Puyallup tribes. And Chief Leschi leads in January of 1856 a battle to take Seattle. So it really varies from 300 Native Americans up to several thousand. There's no direct account of how many natives there are, but hundreds to thousands of Native Americans descend on Seattle with the goal of eliminating the city from the map. The battle lasts about a day, and while there's no clear winner, Seattle is successfully defended by the settlers. More Native Americans die than white settlers. So you could probably look at this as a settler victory and a Native American loss, but it's not conclusive. A big reason why the settlers are able to defend Seattle is they've got this boat called the Decatur. And the Decatur is docked offshore. It turns its cannons onto the hill from which the Native Americans were emerging and the woods from which Native Americans were emerging. And the Decatur continues to send cannonball fire at the Native Americans, and it's a big reason why Seattle is able to defend itself. Fun fact, there's a Decatur High School just where I grew up, right by where I grew up. We used to play them in sports near Federal Way, Washington, and if you follow the Olympics, Apollo Ono went to Decatur High School. He goes on to be one of the most accomplished U.S. Olympians of all time in the mid-2010 era, early 2000s on speed skating. So he's a Washington graduate. All right. Well, this leads to a manhunt after the battle. Again, the Native American forces in the Battle of Seattle were led by Chief Leschi. This leads to a manhunt, which is led by a Snoqualmie Native chief, Patankim. I have a hard time with his name, Patankim, who is a chief of the Snoqualmie tribe, and he leads a manhunt for Leschi. And it leads to several battles between Native American tribes, the Snoqualmie, who are loyal to the U.S. government, and the combined forces that Leschi has put together. Also, after the Battle of Seattle, Governor Stevens becomes paranoid, believing that there is no way that the tribes could have united against a major city like Seattle without some help from sympathetic settlers. And so Stevens declares martial law, saying that he's in charge entirely, gives him more powers to have martial law, and he begins to lock up any white settlers who protest the war or who are sympathetic to Native Americans. So he starts locking up settlers who speak out against the mistreatment of Native Americans. Well, that's illegal. And several judges intervene, and one judge who intervenes is Judge Edward Lander, and he calls for Stevens' arrest. So the governor of our territory, the main political figure in our territory, the highest power in the land, Governor Isaac Stevens, is actually going to be arrested by the judges in Washington for overstepping his powers. However, Stevens just turns around and has the judge arrested and thrown in jail. So Stevens is not arrested. Instead, he arrests the judge. Well, this leads to a lot of attention from the national government and from President Franklin Pierce back in Washington, D.C., and the federal government, the D.C. government, has to get involved. The Senate begins to discuss all these issues in Washington. They call for Isaac Stevens' resignation. And they get close to sending out federal troops to arrest Stevens. So Stevens, the governor of Washington, just pardons himself, which means forgives himself of any crimes. And then he backs down. Isaac Stevens releases the prisoners, the white settlers, from jail. And he changes his statements from "we're going to annihilate all hostile Indians" to decides to take a route of trying to negotiate peace. So because the federal government cracks down on him, Stevens now wants to end the war peacefully. So under political pressure and sensing a stalemate, meaning a tie, Stevens decides to try and negotiate peace. He calls a couple different councils, and it's the second time they meet at the Council of Fox Island that Stevens meets with different tribal leaders, and he ends up expanding the Squally and Puyallup tribal reservation land. He throws in a whole new reservation called the Muckleshoot Reservation. There's a big Muckleshoot casino, very active in Washington today. but he throws in additional land, gives them back some of their farmland, and he starts to do this with the tribes, expanding some of the reservations. However, Stevens is still angry at Leschi for leading the Battle of Seattle, and he is demanding Leschi's capture. It's the one caveat, the one thing Stevens will not back down on is he wants Leschi's capture. Well, Leschi, who at this point also wants peace, sends his brother Quyamuth to negotiate with Stevens, but his brother, Leschi's brother, Quyamuth, is killed and murdered in Isaac Stevens' office under mysterious circumstances. So then they start to capture Leschi's family, and eventually a nephew of Leschi, Sluggia, betrays his uncle, betrays the chief, and he turns in his location and he tells Isaac Stevens where his uncle Leschi is hiding, and in turn for 50 blankets. So he trades his uncle's whereabouts for 50 blankets. So Leschi's captured, and he undergoes a couple trials, and they're very highly publicized trial. In the first trial, Leschi, it's a hung jury, meaning they can't decide whether or not he's guilty. And Leschi's lawyers and Leschi himself are arguing that he didn't do anything wrong, that it was war. So a quote from Leschi is, "I do not know anything about your laws. I have supposed that the killing of our men in wartime was not murder. If it was, the soldiers who killed Indians are guilty of murder too." So his argument is it was war, not murder, but war. "I went to war because I believed that the Indian had been wronged by the white men, and I did everything in my power to beat the Boston soldiers, but for lack of numbers, supplies, and ammunition, I have failed." So he's saying, yeah, I fought a battle against the United States government, but I'm not guilty of murder. And Boston soldiers is a general term for U.S. soldiers from back east. So the first trial ends in a hung jury, meaning they can't decide what to do with him. The second trial, Isaac Stevens does not let Leschi or his lawyers call any evidence in his defense. So he's given a one-sided trial, and he is hung. So Chief Leschi is hung and executed. He's found guilty of murder. And this was a big point for the Nisqually tribe and other Native American tribes in Washington, was they felt like Chief Leschi was simply like a general fighting in a war, not actually guilty of murder. And they continued to make that point for about 160 years till 2004, when the Washington government actually overturned Leschi's conviction and found him not guilty of murder. And one thing they wrote in 2004, one thing the state government wrote was, "Be it further resolved that the Senate recognize Chief Leschi as a courageous leader whose sacrifice for his people is worthy of honor and respect, and that the residents of the state of Washington solemnly remember Chief Leschi as a great and noble man." So 16 years ago, it was decided that it was an unfair trial and that he was actually innocent. And that really ends the battles, the War of Puget Sound. It ends the Yakima. It really ends a lot of the uprisings that are happening around the state is with the hanging of Leschi. As for the Yakima War itself, it basically just fizzles out. General Wool's plan to occupy Native American hunting grounds and to cut off supplies to the Native Americans eventually starts to work. In the summer of 56. In the summer of 1856, about 600 U.S. soldiers attacked the Yakima Reservation, killing 700 Native American horses. They do capture and publicly execute 24 Native Americans. And that's really the end of the Yakima uprising. They run out of supplies, basically. The Native Americans run out of bullets and supplies. And Kamiakin himself flees to Canada. Years later, he's actually forgiven for his role in the uprising by the U.S. government. He's told he can return to the Yakima Reservation, but Kamiakin refuses, and he spends the rest of his days living in isolation in Canada and later Washington. And that's it. That's the end of these major battles. That's the one. The Puget Sound War ends dramatically when Chief Leschi is executed. The other, the Yakima War, ends when the Yakima tribe runs out of supplies. I'm going to jump into a video that explains this as well, and that will conclude my part of this video.
The wars that have been raging through the Washington Territory have been going on for about half a year. It's now January, and there hasn't been any formal engagements or troop movements for about a month. As it was with most wars in the 19th century and before, winter was a tough time for armies to mobilize. The Native Americans of the Territory of Washington, however, have been masters of their wilderness for generations. The native tribes in open rebellion against the U.S. government were massing in the Cascades. Governor Stevens, responsible for much of the conditions that led to the bloodshed, arrived in Seattle by ship and proclaimed that an offensive attack by the natives and all-out war was not possible. He even went as far as to say that the possibility of an attack on Seattle was no more likely than that of New York City. Natives of the region said otherwise. Rumblings of an attack were on the rise. Natives friendly to whites were warning the population that an attack was imminent. Word spread that their numbers were in the thousands. Rumor was that some of them were scoping out the defenses of Seattle itself in an effort to strategize for an attack. Legend has it that Leschi himself snuck his way into U.S. defenses in disguise. A Navy warship named the Decatur was anchored in Seattle's harbor ready to shell any oncoming attackers. Many civilians, both white and native, evacuated. Soldiers put up defenses. There was so much rumor and misinformation being thrown around, it was possible the tribes weren't even attacking Seattle at all. Then, on the morning of January 26th, a horde of native warriors emerged from the Cascades and descended on Seattle. It was said to have been led by the Nisqually chief Leschi, who had been spending the winter recruiting tribes of many backgrounds and languages. The army consisted of many different tribes commanded by sub-chieftains. There was a slew of different tribes ready to attack the territorial government. The warship Decatur used its cannons to bombard the hillsides swarming with hostile braves. The Battle of Seattle lasted a full day with only 2 deaths on the U.S. side. Native American casualties differ, and it's hard to find agreeable numbers. It's still difficult to find the numbers that even attack Seattle. They go from a few hundred to a couple thousand among sources on the engagement. After the battle, Governor Stevens called for the extermination of all hostile Indians. Both American soldiers and civilian pioneers alike began to raid known peaceful Native American settlements. They would strip them of any arms, huddle them into pseudo-concentration camps, and keep them under surveillance while denying them access to food while stripping them of their personal property. A group of Snoqualmie natives under Chief Pat Canham led a raid on Leschi's camp in the Cascades. The battle lasted 10 hours until the Snoqualmie ran out of ammunition. Leschi's warriors suffered a pretty crushing defeat in the attack, but the Nisqually chief Leschi was able to escape. The Battle of Seattle had more of an effect on Governor Stevens' policy than it did on actual war strategy. Stevens began taking the war a step further. After arriving in the territorial capital of Olympia, he began arresting and detaining Americans who were against the war against the natives. When the Chief Justice of Washington Territory issued a writ of habeas corpus for the release of the opponents of the war, Stevens declared martial law. Judge Edward Lander ruled that Governor Stevens was in contempt of court and marshals were sent to Olympia to detain him. They were ejected from the Capitol, and Stevens ordered Judge Lander's arrest by militia. Lander was arrested and taken to Olympia. He refused to back down, and Stevens had him thrown in with the prisoners the judge had ordered free. Chief Justice Chenoweth responded by organizing a posse of 50 armed volunteers and marched them into Olympia, and Stevens eventually capitulated. The settlers were released, and Stevens was fined, but not without pardoning himself of contempt of court. Word of Stevens' tyrannical actions hit Washington. The U.S. Senate called for his removal over the incident. The Secretary of State censured him and publicly claimed, "Your conduct in that respect does not therefore meet with the favorable regard of the President." Stevens was of the Democratic Party, as was the President, Franklin Pierce. The Whig Party was gaining traction in the territory because of Stevens' actions. 1856, the year this was going on, was also a presidential election year. As March came around and winter was coming to a close, U.S. troops marching again into the White River Valley captured a Klickitat chief that was responsible for the skirmish at Brennan's Prairie. After the chief's execution, 200 warriors descended on the camp, killing several U.S. troops without any native casualties. The White River Valley was still deemed a hotspot. 9 days later, a much larger force of about 100 men marched back into the White River region to establish a blockhouse. A much larger force of Cascadian natives immediately attacked, but this time the soldiers were prepared. This time, 30 native warriors were killed, with only 4 wounded soldiers on the U.S. side. The Battle of Connell's Prairie was the last major conflict of the Puget Sound War. Many of the tribes of the region were running low on supplies, morale was low, and U.S. forces were pushing farther into their territory. Over in the Walla Walla Valley, a U.S. force of 300 men marched from Oregon, secured the Columbia and Snake River confluence. They run into little resistance, but their presence left much of the valley under U.S. control. Conflict in the region was far from over, but it had reached a bit of a standstill. To the west and downstream on the Columbia, Yakima descended down on a region known as the Cascades Rapids and killed 14 settlers and 3 soldiers. In response, a force was sent up the Columbia River from Fort Vancouver. The Yakima retreated, but not without leaving many of their own behind. All prisoners were executed. Up north in the Cascades, the Puget Sound War was coming to a close. Emboldened by the statements made by Governor Stevens calling for the death of all hostile natives, 30 mounted riflemen raided a group of natives who had gathered to fish on the Nisqually River, massacring them. They were mostly women, children, and elderly who had attempted to escape the conflict of the Puget Sound War by finding refuge in the dense temperate jungles of the Cascades. The Mashal Massacre would be the last major engagement of the war. To the southeast, the 300 volunteers from Oregon marched to the old Fort Walla Walla in an effort to stamp out any Walla Walla Palouse resistance. They found what they were looking for, and some 300 warriors attacked the regiment at Status Creek. The battle yielded few results on either side, but many resources were expended. After 5 hours of battle, there were a couple casualties on both sides, but nothing detrimental. The Oregonian volunteers retreated back to Fort Dallas. Sensing a stalemate, Governor Stevens made a sincere attempt at ending hostilities. He called for the Second Walla Walla Council, where Walla Walla, Yakima, and chiefs from the other smaller tribes gathered to put an end to the violence. The council negotiations lasted for about a week, but it ended in failure. Governor Stevens was asked by many native tribes if they could keep their lands, and Stevens would not budge. The council failed to foster peace, but there was at least communication. Stevens left for Fort Dallas, and while en route, he was attacked by a band of native warriors. The fight went into the night, and the forces under the control of Colonel Steptoe were able to keep Governor Stevens protected as he left the region. This battle would be the last major engagement for over a year. General Wool closed the territory beyond the Dalles to white settlement, and Colonel Steptoe kept settlers from crossing into the Walla Walla Valley. Up north in the Cascades, 3 months later, Governor Stevens convened another council, the Council of Fox Island. He met with the leaders of the representatives of tribes most involved in the Puget Sound conflict. Governor Stevens agreed to changes in the Nisqually and Puyallup reservations and even gave them one more reservation at Muckleshoot. The one thing Stevens asked for that couldn't be promised was the capture of Chief Leschi. Leschi had already gone and made peace with the federal troops in the region, but Stevens would not give up. Leschi sent his brother to Stevens to negotiate a surrender. His brother had been put under Stevens' protection, and overnight he ended up getting murdered in the governor's office. The murderer was arrested, but not brought to trial, because no American would testify against him. Stevens ended up leveraging Leschi's nephew, Sluggia, who had betrayed his uncle and gave away Leschi's whereabouts in exchange for 50 blankets. Leschi was put on trial, and it was deemed a hung jury because the judge proceeding the trial ruled that killing of combatants during wartime was not murder. Not satisfied, he was put on trial again, and this time his lawyers were not allowed to introduce exonerating evidence. When Leschi was hanged, even his hangman had reported, "I felt then I was hanging an innocent man, and I believe it yet." Hostilities in the Puget Sound had now come to an end, and it would be more than a year before the tense relations in the Washington Territory would come to boil over again.
All right, 7th graders, as always, thank you for watching. I appreciate you guys getting this far in the video today. Again, if you've completed your assignment, you don't need to come to the Google Meet. And as always, I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you, 7th graders.